Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a first look at an upcoming Tier 10 British heavy tank, the Chieftain Mk.6. And whilst this tank might not be new, it's been in the game files for I think 9 years now, and in 2024 it was tested, so it was brought back to the super test with some changed statistics and was tested. I have a slight feeling and a little bit of an inclination that we're going to be seeing this tank pretty soon. So I'm going to get a quick video out for you, kind of covering it and telling you what do I actually think of the tank. Well, let's get right into it basically. So, the Chieftain Mk.6 is a chieftain at tier 10, is British, but do not get it confused with the tier 10 British reward chieftain, the T95 chieftain. They are different. This is a tank that is, as you know, you want to talk about the history about it. It's a newer iteration of that chieftain, and it is going to be a different tank in terms of its style of play, its statistics, and we'll have a look at it. So, first of all, this tank is going to have absolutely gorgeous DPM. 3000 base DPM. You know, you run a Bond rammer on this thing. You have 3.5k DPM. That is kind of a little bit terrifying. But this thing is going to be a little bit of a DPM monster. It's packing 400 alpha with decent penetration values. Not the best, decent penetration. 270 millimeters standard APCR is actually quite nice. It's the gold penetration that this tank will struggle with. 310 millimeters gold APCR is not great, and you will definitely struggle against super heavies or just tank destroyers with thick armor plates. However, this thing, as quite a few British heavies do, they have Hesh L31 with 140 millimeters of penetration and 550 alpha damage. So that is lovely. We love a tank with Hesh. I mean, personally, I do. No British bias there at all, I promise. This tank is going to be a little bit of a DPM monster, but it will struggle with its penetration. Well, how's the gun handling? Well, really nice, actually. Going to have 1.44 seconds aim time, which is really quite snappy for a heavy tank. And it's going to have 0.31 dispersion. It also has absolutely gorgeous soft dispersion factors. You could probably get away without running a V-stab on this tank. However, if you were, yeah, 0.07 with turret traverse, 0.09 with tank traverse, and 0.09 moving. Yeah, that's kind of quite good. This thing's gun handling will feel lovely and make this like high DPM usable. You shouldn't be missing too many of your shots because the gun handling is lovely. So, what's his mobility like? Well, it's okay. It's kind of very British. It's not going to be the slowest. It's not going to be the quickest. It's 42 forwards. You probably do want to run a turbo on this tank. So, say, for example, you run a Bond turbo. That's 48. That's quite nice. It's just going to struggle to keep up with today's ever-increasing game speed, but it will be okay. You just don't expect to get that early game damage necessarily, just because you're going to be a little bit slower into position. Actually has a really quite nice engine power, which means you're going to be pretty quick to your top speed, and over medium and soft terrain, your speeds are actually okay, because it has a decent power to weight ratio. You've got 10 degrees of gun depression, as most British tanks do at this point. The armor is interesting, and we're going to have a look at the 3D model in a second. On paper, the hull armor is 85 millimeters. The turret armor is 250 millimeters. And obviously, we don't want a repeat of the T95 Chieftain, with that thing's armor model just being frankly ridiculous. And I will tell you now, it's not going to be a repeat, but we'll have a look. You're going to have 2,200 hit points to work with that armor. That's quite nice. You know, you run a hardening, even just standard hardening and slot. That's 2,400. That's 2,500 field mods. That's quite nice, actually. You'll be able to trade one or two effectively. And quite nicely, the thing has 390 meters view range, so you'll actually be able to spot for yourself to an extent. But let's have a look at that armor model. Well, let's have a look at it visually first. So, you can see how this tank differs to the T95 Chieftain, which we already have in the game. It's got a much more rounder hull, so whereas the T95 Chieftain's a little bit flatter, it's much more rounded, got this kind of like duck nose, similar to like the American tanks. We have this like, I believe, some kind of like missile launcher on the right hand side, obviously operable, but it's just kind of part of the visual model, not part of the armor model, as you can see. And the first thing we notice here is this thing has a cupola that is significantly bigger than the T95 Chief. But let's have a look at this thing's live armor. So this cuts out all of the bits and bobs that aren't part of the armor model, so we can kind of get a nice clean view. So on flat ground, with the Chieftain shooting at itself with its 270mm APCR, we can see that this thing's armor is actually not great. And the on paper hull armor is kind of showing its head. So the lower plate is huge and very weak. You know, at its thickest, it's like 115mm. So not great. And that is going to be pretty hard to hide. And it's pennable from all angles, apart from like the most extreme angles. So that is going to be a weak point on flat ground for sure. Its upper hull is kind of okay. The front part of it's very weak. Once again, 200mm, but you kind of get up towards the outer extremities, it becomes quite strong. But we'll have a look in a second and see if that's going to actually be weak to have a feeling it probably is. We've got this kind of like funky turret ring, which is pennable in some places, but not all. So that should be quite okay, quite reliable. But we have the big issue here, and we can kind of see it on the visual model, of this kind of flat bulbous area, kind of to the left-hand side of the gun. And that is going to be a pretty big weak point. You know, at its thickest, it's like 250, 260mm. That is pretty huge and pretty hard to hide. We also have this kind of other weak spot on to the left-hand side, further of the turret, as you can kind of see here below the cupola, which is also going to be weak, and that's going to be especially weak. It's quite flat. And we can see how the cupola, which is pretty large, is very weak and also kind of hard to hide. But let's put this thing in its maximum 10 degrees of gun depression and see how its turret armor performs. Well, better, but not perfect. Its cupola is significantly bigger than that of the T95 Chieftain, so it's going to be visible, which is a massive prop because that tank is just stupid when it's in a hull down. Well, this thing is going to be slightly easier to counter because its cupola is visible and it's quite large. And also, you just shoot underneath the gun. You know, you fire heat at this thing underneath the gun and you're penning that pretty much 100% of the time. So, let's compare it to the USA, the E5 with 340mm penetration. And we can kind of see how that underneath the gun becomes very weak. Obviously, you're firing heat, so you have to be careful to not hit the gun because it will be absorbed. But either side, left and right of the gun is, 240. You have a 100% chance of penning that. You even can kind of pen the kind of top part of the hull, sorry, part of the turret, just because you have heat and you just kind of go, haha, normalization, with like a 30 to 40% chance. So we can kind of see how this thing is not going to be ridiculous in a hull down kind of scenario. Don't get me wrong, it's going to be strong. However, not going to be broken. But this is the T95 Chieftain on flat ground versus 340mm. And you can kind of just see how, as I said, that whole hull is just going to kind of become a weak spot. Yes, there are places where you will just randomly hit and it will bounce. However, that is a rather large frontal target to be able to just fire heat at and pen, like 100% of the time. And that turret and that cupola. So we can kind of see how this thing is not going to be an armor. Its armor is not going to be incredible. The thing that is going for this tank is its great DPM, it's great gun handling, basically. You kind of have to work around those two statistics and not necessarily rely on this tank's armor because it isn't going to perform. But we've spoken enough about the T95 Chieftain. Let's actually compare the new Chieftain Mk.6 to the T95 Chieftain and the Super Conqueror. So we can see straight away the DPM advantage that the Chieftain Mk.6 is going to have is significant. It's going to be 400 more than the Super Conqueror and 700 more than the T95 Chieftain. That's significant, and you will feel it, and it will be a DPM monster. We can see that the penetration values for standard is the same between the Chieftain Mk.6 and the Chieftain T95, and significantly better than the 259mm of AP for the Super Conqueror. We can see that the heat penetration, the gold penetration, interestingly, for the Chieftain Mk.6 is going to have 1 less millimeter of penetration than the T95 Chieftain. So just bear that in mind, I guess. We can see the alpha damage, so the Chieftain Mk.6 is going to have 40 less than the Chieftain T95, and it's going to have the same as the Super Conqueror. We can see, therefore, the rate of fire is higher and the reload time is shorter, giving us that higher DPM. Coming down to gun handling, as I said, this is another one of this tank's strong points, and it's going to be a good story here. The aim time is going to be gorgeous. 1.44 seconds aim time is simply amazing. You compare that to the 1.92 seconds for the Super Conqueror and the 2 seconds for the Chieftain T95, and yeah, this thing's going to be snappy. You are going to be aimed very quickly, and it's going to be really lovely for snapshots, especially when you combine it with this tank's dispersion of 0.31 compared to the Super Conqueror's 0.32 and the T95 Chieftain's 0.34. We also have just better soft statistics here. The soft statistics for the Chieftain is going to be the same, so if it's Chieftain Mk.6, it's going to be the same as the Super Conquerors, and significantly better than the T95 Chieftains, 0.14 when moving, 0.14 when traversing the tank, and 0.11 turret. That's a good story already right there. All of these tanks have 10 degrees of gun depression, we know that. Mobility. Chieftain Mk.6 is going to be the quickest out of these three. However, 42, as I said, is not going to be the quickest, and you are still going to want a turbo. But 42 forwards, 40 for the Chieftain T95, and 34 for the Super Conqueror. The Chieftain Mk.6 will be the quickest, which is nice. And then coming down to the armor on paper, we know that the Chieftain T95's kind of party trick, and its only thing it has going for it anymore, because it has been kind of nerfed into the ground, and rightfully so. Maybe not as nerfed as it did get, however, is its armor. 350mm on the turret and a tiny cupola. Hull down, it's an absolute beast. The Chieftain Mk.6 is not going to be the same. It is going to be strong in a hull down, but it is going to be no stronger than that of a Type 71. It's going to have definite weak points. It's got a rather large cupola. Fire heat will begin to kind of bully the tank's armor. So don't expect it to be a hull down monster. It's two things that it has going for it is great gun handling and lovely. Yeah. Well, I kind of hinted at it at the start of the video that I think we're going to see this tank pretty soon. And I have a slight inclination that we're going to have an auction event at the end of January. Probably sometime around the 25th of January. I have a feeling we're going to have an auction event. Very similar to what we did last year, where we had the BZ-72-1 release, that tier 10 Chinese rocket booster heavy tank. And just looking through the game files, the DBV-152, that is almost all but confirmed to be the assembly shop tank in February. Then the only other tier 10 tank in the game files that is unreleased is the Chieftain Mk.6. They are going to want to have a tier 10 tank in that auction. And especially because the Chieftain was tested last year quite actively for a couple of weeks, I have a feeling the Chieftain Mk.6 is going to be part of that auction. And personally, I think it's going to be a decent tank to pick up. And, right, having played against this tank a couple of times when it was released, I will tell you now, good players made it work. You had to be a really good player to do really good DPGs tank. And the good players did do, around 4 to 4.5k DPGs. However, if you are an average player, you struggle to know positions, rotations, timings, your gun handling, your accuracy, your gun kind of stability is not great. Chieftain Mk.6, you will struggle to make it work. Just because his armor is not very forgiving. It is a great platform if you can do everything possible to mitigate the fact that this armor is not very reliable. Its cupola is huge. If you can mitigate that and work with its great DPM and great gun handling, you can do really good things in this tank. It's just that if a bad player is playing this tank, yeah, they will be a bad player. Just because the tank has great DPM and gun handling doesn't mean that a bad player can make this tank work. In situations, yes, they will. But the majority of the time, the armor is of a nature that is not very forgiving, and it will catch people out. So, that is the Chieftain Mk.6, and what I think is going to be January 2024's, right, 2025's now, January 2025's auction kind of primo new tier 10 tank. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this tank. Do you agree with me that it's going to be the auction tank? Will you be picking it up? Do you think it looks good? Play against it? Do let me know. I'll see you all again very soon.